Hello and welcome to Engineering Ethics at NJIT. I'm Dan Estrada, your instructor. This is Lesson 3 Hangout. So the lecture video should already be on the website. This is the Hangout video where I'm available. This is basically office hours for you to ask questions, for us to sort of chat about some of the material. If you have questions about class, about the material, if you want another way to interact with me or your fellow students, especially for online students who don't have a class period to attend. This Hangout is supposed to be sort of like open office hours. I do have regular office hours on Tuesday morning, but if you're an online student and don't want to come to campus, you can come to these Hangouts to ask questions. Ask questions, chat about the material. This is supposed to be class time. So the first thing I want to talk about, though, is that no one is here except for Marissa. I'm very glad you're here, Marissa. Last week, only a few people came to class also. So maybe this isn't a good time for people. So the first thing I want to talk about is maybe we should change the Hangout time to a different day, maybe a different time on Wednesday. If I were to move it back an hour to 1 o'clock on Wednesday, would people be more able to come, less able to come? Marissa, I don't know if you have a commentary on that.
It doesn't really make a difference for me.
I can't hear you if you're speaking. I see you took off your mute, but. I still don't hear you speaking. She says her mic is not working. That's fine. If you want to talk in chat, or you can just try to fix your mic, that's fine. So for everyone else who's watching, please leave in the open thread for week 3. For lesson 3, there's a discussion forum. There's an open thread in that forum. In the open thread, if you have a time that you would rather, if you want to come to Hangouts, and there's a time that works for you, let me know. A time that's better than noon on Wednesday. 1 o'clock on Wednesday would be good for me. I can also do in the early afternoon on Tuesday and Thursday. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Around this time, 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock would be best for me. But yeah, Marissa says it doesn't matter very much for her. That's good. What I'd like to see is people who have time constraints so they can't make it here at noon on Wednesday, and then but who want to come. If you can't make it here on Wednesday at noon and you don't want to come on Wednesday at noon, that's fine. Remember, these Hangouts are extra credit. The lecture is technically also extra credit too. For the online sections, neither of these, I have 2 hours of video per week. That video is not required watching. You get extra credit, attendance credit for it, but it's not a requirement. You can pass the class perfectly fine. You can get an A in the class perfectly well by just doing the assignments and engaging the material on Moodle. Apart from these videos. These videos are meant to help people who can use the additional contact with students or with me, who can use a time to have these kind of digital office hours. So I don't want all these videos on the Moodle page to feel like a burden or to feel like overwhelming. I'm trying to provide a lot of resources. And if you want to take advantage of these resources but you don't have time on Wednesday at noon, please let me know and I'll try to accommodate. I'll collect your responses to that and I'll make an announcement probably this weekend, see if there's a change in schedule. Apart from schedule change, let me go ahead and just jump into the course here. Yeah. There we go. Yeah, so we're on lesson 3. Lesson 2 has been turned in. I'm not caught up on grading yet. There's a lot of material that I haven't graded from lesson 2. Your replies that were due last night. I haven't graded. I've had some students come up and talk to me about why their grade looks the way it does. So let me just make this clear, because I've had a lot of emails about this. I think most of you get it, but just to make clear, in case you were confused. So this is in the syllabus. At the end of the syllabus is the point totals. So apart from lessons 10 and 11, every week is worth 100 points. Every lesson is worth 100 points. Oh yeah, Marissa, go ahead and take off, come back as you want. It would be nice if you could chat about some of the material, so if you could come back with a fixed mic, that'd be great. Thank you. Yeah, okay, so each lesson is worth 100 points. And that means 80 points for the discussion. That's 50 points for your post and 30 points for your replies. And then 20 points on the side for your quiz. The 80 points of discussion has confused a couple of people. So some students, for instance, have seen that they got like a 45 out of 80. And they're like, why did I get a 45 out of 80? That seems like a bad grade. Well, 45 out of 80 would be a bad grade, but you didn't really get a 45 out of 80. What you got is a 45 out of 50. A 45 out of 50 is a 90%. That's an A. That's an A post. So if you got a 45 out of 50, you did well. You earned an A on your post. But your total grade for that lesson is out of 80 points, and that includes the 30 points for replies. So if I haven't graded your replies yet, your lesson 3 grade will look artificially low. Your lesson 2 grade will look artificially low. So wait for those replies to come in. Please wait for a week, and after the due date. Please wait for at least a week after the due date before emailing me about your grades. It takes me a while to go through everything and fix it up. So I thank you for your patience. This is usually where I would pause to see if there are any questions or comments or concerns. But
Can you hear me now or no?
not a lot of people here yet. Okay, Marissa went away. She'll be back, hopefully.
My audio working now? Hello?
Marissa, I'm still not hearing you. Can you see the, in the corner of the window, there's a little mic icon, and when I'm talking, I can see the volume of the microphone moving up and down. Is your computer reading the sound and it's just not going through, or is it just not reading the sound? Mm-hmm.
Is it working now? Did that change anything?
Oh, it might have been my fault. My speakers might have been. Can you say something, Marissa? Yeah,
Can
yeah,
you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, okay.
So I don't know. I think because it's recording on my computer, I couldn't have heard anything you said up to now. Also, okay. Now we actually have other people in the chat, so we can have a class. Thank you for coming, Marissa.
No problem.
Did you look over the lesson material? Was there anything interesting you wanted to talk about?
Yes, I did. I thought it was just like mind-blowing that as far as the car, the Ford Pinto debacle, I think it's ridiculous that they didn't think of not even just like the ethical repercussions or whatever, but they didn't think like that they were going to lose any customers because of this. Like they didn't think that when 180 people were going to die and 180 more people were going to be injured and severely burned, that people would stop buying the cars prematurely. Like, I'm surprised that was like written nowhere in the literature that they were concerned about that. They were just worried about like, okay, well, let's put a monetary value on these lives, which is like, that's in my opinion, that's ethically concerning, but like, that's what they wanted to do, whatever. But they didn't even think.
Yeah. Good. In my live lectures in the classes, I've had a couple of students say that to respond to the Ford Pinto by saying that Ford actually made the right decision, that it was the right business decision. Because I mean, look at the numbers. The point of the business is to make money, and if you just look at the numbers, it looks like it was the right decision to make to not fix the car. But the point you made that it's not just the finances, but it's all these other things like the reputation that people don't trust their cars. I mean, we should be clear that Ford is still selling millions of vehicles every year. Lots of people buy Fords. Ford is still a trusted brand name and so on. But the Pinto debacle did have an impact, and Ford had to work to get themselves out of that reputation hole. So they had to regain the trust of the consumers. They had to present themselves as a safe vehicle and this kind of stuff. And all that stuff cost money also. So when you look at Ford's calculation here, it's not enough to just look at the dollar values and say that this was a good business decision. It's not enough to see that this money is more than this money and to know that this is the right decision to make, even if we're just thinking about business, even if we're not thinking about ethics, even just thinking about business, because it also matters what's going into this number and is it taking into account all the things that matter. So the cost that they project is only the cost to the court cases settling for the burn victims and the injury victims and so on. They don't at all consider what would happen if there's a public backlash and we have to deal with the PR concerns and we have to do a bunch of advertising campaigns in order to recover a reputation, right? That's also cost, and that's cost that's not being considered in this, but that's cost that's relevant to the business success. So you might think that even if we're just evaluating on business terms, that Ford's calculation here is still too narrow, that the scope of consideration is just too small.
I think another like personal example that I've dealt with is over the summer I worked for the Honest Company, which is like it's like the CEO is like Jessica Alba, and they sell like baby products and like body bath stuff, and they had a enormous recall of their baby wipes because they started to find mold in the baby wipes. And I remember like I my main job was just to like go through the wipes and like check to see how many units had mold in them and how many units just had like dirt and stuff in them that wasn't supposed to be in them. And I remember just thinking like, why are we going through all these wipes instead of just like ditching them all and throwing them all out? And all of my managers and all the people around me were like, oh, well, we're trying to kind of like do damage control and be like, well, if we check this number of units and this specific lot number, then we can consider that lot number as like clean and good and like there aren't any bad units in it. But that turned out to not even be the case because we still weren't checking enough units per lot number, and we couldn't deem them good. And so we ended up losing most of the inventory anyway, and it was a whole big fiasco. And not only did we lose all the money with the with the baby wipes, but like we lost a bunch of customers because they didn't trust us. This is a company that says like, you know, we're organic and we're like a tier above, we're like a special type of product. And then all these angry moms and their babies, they're like, oh, there's mold on these wipes, I'm never shopping here again. You know what I mean? And it was just a mess.
Yeah, and dealing with the situation like that, and trying to do the damage control so that you're not just bleeding more and more costs.
Right.
If those are your interests, then that gives you a certain kind of perspective on what the right decisions to make are. I mean, from the manager's perspective, maybe we should go through all of these wipes to see if we can recover any of them. From the worker's perspective, that's a big hassle and you're not getting a lot out of it. But the manager just has to tell you what to do. They don't have to actually do it, so it's a little bit easier for them.
There were a lot of 12-hour work days, 5 a.m. to like 5 p.m.
Yeah. I mean, this also brings up another issue, is that when there's this kind of crisis, the expenses start racking up real quickly. So, I mean, the fact that their product went bad was already a major expense. They already lost a lot of value there. And so they're already bleeding, and so they want to bleed as little as possible from then on. And but everything that you do in order to manage the situation is another expense. These are the kinds of things that bring people to want to cut corners. Like if we don't have to go through every single box to check that the wipes are okay, then maybe we don't do it. But the issue on the other hand is, well, have you compromised the safety of your product to the people that are using it? Have you compromised other things like your reputation?
And another scary thing was, after we had checked several hundred lot numbers, we kind of got to the point where we were like, okay, these wipes, we've checked a certain amount per lot number. So the wipes that are remaining, we can say, you know, pretty surely that we can send them back out. And then we did. And then there were still like bad wipes in those lot numbers and people were reporting it. And we were just like, okay, like clearly we have a flawed system of dealing with this many recalls. And it was our first big recall. So, I mean, I'm not surprised that it went down the way that it did. It's not like a huge company. But as the lower end worker, it was a huge pain to have to go through every single wipe.
Yeah, and I mean, these are the risks with running a business. And the main thing to appreciate from these kinds of cases is that when things start going wrong, it also heightens the pressure and it heightens the anxiety, and it makes the decision making a lot more difficult. It's precisely in those difficult situations where we have to be thinking most clearly, because I mean, it would be very easy for a manager to say something like, just send them out, but that's not safe, and that risks the business on a larger scale. So you have to making the right decisions in those cases when the pressure's on. I mean, that's the big challenge. And it's also the kind of challenge that I can't exactly prepare you for. For one reason, for one thing, I'm not putting a lot of pressure on you. I mean, the class has deadlines and so on, but it's not the kind of pressure that you'll see in your career. So the point here isn't to prepare you with like training for dealing with crisis situations, but it's really to get you sort of conceptually prepared to understand that when there's this crisis situation, that's going to make the decision making more difficult. That's going to make the kinds of decisions that you make. It just makes everything more challenging. And preparing that you're going to have to deal with those kinds of situations. Yeah. This is why I always appreciate when students have work experience on the job, actual on-the-job experience to relate like this. And this was also not a fast food on-the-job experience example. A lot of the experiences that I get from students in this class have to do with working at a fast food place and mold or some other unsanitary condition, or like, you know, food falls on the floor and they pick it up and they serve it anyway. Those kinds of stuff.
I'm so lucky to be able to have this job, honestly. it was such a great experience. I was doing a quality control. So like every single day I was checking for flaws in products, and every single day I would go to my boss and be like, is this bad enough to like have to write a report about it and to like send it back to the manufacturer? Or you would have to do the math to figure out like what percentage of the product that you checked was defective, and if that made a difference in the whole entire shipment that you got. So, we would only have to check maybe 14 cases, but we had several thousand cases that just got delivered, and you had to do the math to figure out, well, is this above the 2% defect rate? And if it is it like bad enough that we have to send it back? And with the wipes, what we were finding is that we would find like a lot of things that like a lot of wipes that were defective, but it would still be under I think we had a 2 or 3% defect rate. And we would still send them back because with the mold thing, we were just like, oh, well, it could get worse. So we almost had to lower the like acceptable defect rate because we just weren't having it at the time. We were like, this is too severe of a situation for us to have a defect even this high. And it was just such a great job. I wish I could work that job like for several more years, but I got to study.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. So I have a question. Working quality control, I don't have any experience doing this, but my suspicion is that the work often involves raising problems or like finding problems and then reporting on those problems, announcing the problem. And sometimes that might be difficult, especially if the problem that you're announcing is a major, like a major recall, like you were talking about. That being the messenger in that kind of case might be difficult. Did you ever find it difficult to report the problems, even knowing that they would cause more problems?
It was, I mean, like, I never thought of it as like a moral dilemma. I always did it. It was just like, oh God, like I have to go report this bad news to my boss, and then my boss has to report that bad news to his boss. And I always knew that like if there was a huge problem with the wipes, that we were going to have to take people from other departments and, focus them on this problem, because it was just too big for the, 5 or 6 quality control employees that we had, quality control technicians. And so I was only working there from May to August, and a lot of the other people there were working longer than me. And so if there was ever like really bad news and we were like, oh, this, this lot number that was supposed to be good, turns out it was bad, I would just be like, I'll handle it. Like, I'll go do it. Like, I don't mind being yelled at by the manager or whatever, because I'm the bearer of bad news. But it was never like a moral dilemma, like, oh gosh, I know this is going to be a lot of extra work. Should I tell somebody? Like, it was never like that. Because that was up to my manager, because even if it was a big problem, it wasn't my job to then like delegate fixing the problem to other people. That was my manager's job, so it was fine.
Yeah, good. I mean, that sounds like a positive work experience. Even dealing with big problems, it sounds like a positive work experience. I'll say, just in contrast, we'll see a lot of cases in this class where employees don't have such a good experience. And in particular, employees feel pressure, even to the point of being fired, for raising objections or raising safety concerns. So I just wanted to point out, this is a passage in the Mark Dowie article that I didn't talk about in the lecture, but so this is in the part of the Mark Dowie article where he's talking about Lee Iacocca and how Lee Iacocca is sort of setting the culture within Ford. In particular, the safety doesn't sell culture, that safety is a luxury. So Mark Dowie says in the article, when it was discovered that the gas tank was unsafe, did anyone go to Iacocca and tell him? Hell no, replied an engineer who worked on the Pinto, a high company official for many years, and who, unlike several others at Ford, maintains a necessarily clandestine concern for safety. So the engineer says, that person would have been fired. The person going to Lee Iacocca would have been fired. Safety wasn't a popular subject around Ford these days, and with Lee it was taboo. Whenever a problem was raised that meant a delay in the Pinto, Lee would chomp on a cigar, look out the window, and say, read the product objectives and get back to work. And again, the product objectives are about the size and weight safety doesn't sell. Again, from the engineers, yeah, the 2,000 pounds, $2,000 limit, the engineer says, Iacocca enforced these limits with an iron hand. The point is that engineers, I mean, if this is how the CEO is acting in response to safety concerns, engineers probably don't want to be coming to the boss with these concerns. They might be worried about getting fired or just getting on his bad side. Like, right, if you're the messenger bearing bad news, then maybe you end up getting punished simply for bearing the bad news. Now, that's not how it should be, of course. I mean, if you're being hired to be quality control, then it's your job to find these problems and report them. And if you do that, then you're doing your job. So, I mean, that should be okay, but not everything's ideal, right? And the CEO has a lot of influence over how the culture operates, over what people accept or don't accept within that business. And so when the CEO is making it clear that he doesn't care about the safety concerns, that you might be in trouble for raising safety concerns, then that's going to make all the engineers below him also sort of just throw up their hands when safety concerns come up. I mean, after all, if the boss isn't going to fight on these issues, then why should I? It's not going to get me in favor with the boss. It's not going to help my career. So then why am I going to make it an issue? The answer to that question, why do you make an issue, is because people might die, right? So if you're doing these cars, I don't know if people will die from moldy wipes, possibly, but these are issues for public safety, public health and safety. And
as far as we knew, they weren't like a biohazard. It wasn't like, you know, they needed to be freaking torched and burned and like never talked about again. It was just that it was gross. And, you know, like when a mom who like just had her first baby opens up a pack of baby wipes and it has black freaking mold in it, it's gross and it's scary. You know what I mean? Even if you know, like logically, you know, the only reason they were moldy is because they didn't have like alcohol in them. They didn't have preservatives and stuff like that in them, because they say, you know, they're organic wipes. They say, you know, we don't have all these harsh chemicals. It won't give your baby any, you know, rashes or whatever. It won't hurt their skin. It won't irritate their skin. So it was mostly organic oils and stuff like that, organic, what's it called, scents to make the baby wipes have that smell. And so it was never like an issue, like a public health, public safety issue. It was more just like we're going to lose so many customers because they're not going to trust our brand anymore. And we had to get, that was another thing, is we had to get a new vendor, because our old vendor was just like not cooperating with us. They were like, oh, we don't see the problem, blah, blah, blah. Or they would send us new wipes and they would still be bad. So we had to get a new vendor, but the new vendor had different packaging for the baby wipes or something, and we started sending those out with the new packaging, and everybody lost their minds. They were like, oh, this packaging looks different, it doesn't have the same lid, and like it's hard to take the wipes out of the packaging. So we had to take those off the shelves because people just stopped buying them, and it was this whole thing. It was this whole fiasco. And eventually we went back to the original vendor, but we had like a completely different deal with them, and it was a mess. It was a fiasco. And I'm glad that I didn't have to deal with the logistics of it. And I just had to be on the low end inspecting wipes.
Yeah, it's a great story. It's a great example for the stuff. Yeah, I was going to say earlier that the organic stuff, I mean, there's a reason why we put preservatives in things.
Yeah.
And one of the things this points to is that I think one of the lessons of your story is that you can't please everyone all the time. That you make any change and someone's going to get mad and things get difficult. But one of the things, so if the consumers are demanding organic products, that's what they want. That's why the product is attractive to the customers. But that organic product doesn't actually work. It creates these issues like mold and so on. Then maybe the thing that the customers want isn't the thing that we should be giving them. They say they don't want chemicals, but they also want no mold on their wipes, and you have to have one or the other. You can't have it both ways.
Like, make up your mind. And then people were freaking out because we put like one extra ingredient on the the ingredients list or whatever, and they were like, "Is that an organic ingredient?" And it's like, oh my god, it's an ingredient that stops there from being wipe on your molds that you're putting on your baby's body. So
yeah,
you choose what you want.
Yeah, and thinking about these kinds of customer relations, it sort of makes sense why someone like Lee Iacocca would have this sort of no wiggle room policy on this issue. I mean, because if you start giving the people what they want, then who knows what's going to happen. So Iacocca is, no, here's what I want for this car, and then just make it happen, and tells his workers just make it happen, and they do, right? And they put the car on the road. Yeah, good. There's more people in the chat now. I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in and say something, comment on the Pinto case, or not. Tim's not even paying attention. Good. Oh, I guess one thing another thing I didn't say in the lecture. So there's controversy about how the Pinto case all shakes out. In fact, there's some arguments that are made that, in fact, Ford made the right. So in my classes, people argue that Ford made the right business decision, and usually that's just on the basis of the money. But there's other arguments that maybe Ford wasn't as morally blameworthy as tends to be discussed in these engineering ethics classes. So I just wanted to point this out. If you go to the Wikipedia article on the Ford Pinto, there's a couple of references to this 1991 Gary Schwartz article called The Myth of the Pinto. So the Myth of the Pinto, the article argues that the Pinto case that we've been talking about, and we're going to continue talking about for the next few weeks, that it's really overblown, especially in these engineering ethics classes. And that if you actually look at Ford's decision-making without the sort of sensationalist Mark Dowie article, that Ford's decision-making doesn't look as horrific as it's sometimes made out in these engineering ethics classes. So the Pinto case happens in the 70s and early 80s. What was I going to say? Oh, Pinto case happened in the 70s. Challenger explosion happens not too long after that. It's these major engineering, very public engineering disasters that really drives the push for engineering ethics as a requirement for engineers in college. Right, so nowadays you have to take this as a required class for engineers, even for non-engineers have to take this class. And the reason that it's a required class is because there's this huge push to be thinking about ethics cases, partly in light of things like the Pinto. So because of the Pinto case, so this case ends up getting talked about quite a lot in these ethics classes. In fact, there's a textbook. Here's the textbook. The person who taught this class before me would have their students buy this book and then go through all the articles in the book. I'm not making the whistleblowing articles we'll do in 2 weeks come from this book. One of them is by Douglas Birch. But this is like a core engineering ethics case, and it's kind of a staple in these engineering ethics classes. And engineering ethics classes, everyone's sort of hypersensitive to ethical issues, and so people have these sort of visceral reactions, these very angry reactions at Ford for making this kind of calculation. But what Schwartz argues in this article is that this kind of visceral reaction is mostly the product of, one, the engineering ethics environment, and two, the sort of sensationalist Mark Dowie article. And he says that both of these are sort of overblown, and that if we step back and are a little more calm about this, then maybe Ford didn't do so wrong. One bit of evidence that he uses to say that Ford's decision-making wasn't so egregious was also used by Ford during the court case itself, which was that one of the engineers who worked at Ford on the Pinto and knew about all the dangers with the Pinto, nevertheless bought a Pinto for himself, and then a few years later bought another Pinto for his teenage daughter. And Ford, during the court cases, the fact that one of Ford's own engineers was still buying a Pinto for his personal use and for his family's use, this is part of what ended up swaying the jury that Ford wasn't being negligent in these cases. Because if they were legitimately negligent, then the engineers wouldn't have bought the car for themselves. So the fact that engineers are buying the same car for themselves means that it's not complete negligence. This is one of the reasons why Ford ended up escaping the criminal charges in this case. Now, I don't know that this is a good argument, and I'm sort of skeptical of Schwartz. I think Schwartz is a little too sympathetic to the corporate position here. But there's a genuine controversy. There's some controversy over exactly how many people die. Mark Dowie, I think in the article, says hundreds of people died. Ford, in their calculations, estimated 180 people died. And I think the actual number might even be lower than that. So this is one of the things that Schwartz settles. If you're interested in the details of the case, if you are in some sense sympathetic with Ford's position in this case, you might want to read the Schwartz article and give a contrary opinion. I just wanted to point that out in case people want to get into the argument. Would anyone like to talk about anything else from this week? So we talked about the Ford Pinto. We also did the trolley problem cases. Trolley problem cases are kind of fun. Trolley problem case is supposed to be an example of consequentialism, consequentialist reasoning about the outcomes. Yeah.
Just back on the Ford Pinto case. I'm surprised that so many people say that Ford made the right decision, despite their numbers being basically exactly how they thought they would be, you know, them losing about as much money, not even as much money as they thought they would lose, just because it was so public, like you said, it was such like a public scare and a public outrage. And I imagine that the people who lost loved ones because their car erupted into flames when they got hit, probably don't really appreciate that a giant corporation is putting a number, putting a monetary value on their loved one's life. You know what I mean? Like they can settle the court cases, they can pay for the medical bills, whatever. But I'm sure they don't appreciate that Ford thought of it ahead of time. They thought like, okay, these are the consequences that could happen, and they still went through with it. Just because I think that's just like a moral dilemma. Like, I'm surprised that so many people say that Ford still did the right thing even after that.
And people say that Ford did the right thing, and then they trust Ford with their lives, right? Buying more cars from Ford. Ford still has I think still has a fairly positive reputation. Right? It's like an American car company. Despite the Pinto, that I think Ford still has a positive reputation, even for safety. I mean, so I guess that's also an ethical dilemma, not for Ford, but for the people buying the cars. I mean, should they still keep buying these cars? Should they trust Ford?
That's like the biggest thing for me is like, should they trust Ford knowing that like they consider things like that? They bypass the safety laws and stuff like that because they're trying to be, you know, competitive worldwide.
Yeah, I rest assured that if you kill a bunch of people in gasoline explosions, you will not continue to have your freedom for very much longer. But Ford can do this and still be a top corporation. And it's not just Ford. BP. So BP, we're going to do the BP oil spill in a few weeks. BP is another major world corporation, global corporation, and they commit one of the largest environmental disasters ever. It kills 11 people. It has huge environmental consequences. And the impact for BP was, I think they went from the second top oil manufacturer to the fourth. I think they had to sell off a lot of their properties to deal with the cleanup effort. And so they lost ground from being the second position oil company in the world to the fourth position oil company in the world, as opposed to being required to dissolve and break up and not operate anymore, which is what you might do to a person who goes around killing people and destroying the planet. But not for the corporation.
Well, the thing is about these cases is that you have to realize that this all occurs in a free market economy, and there's competition going on, and risks need to be made in order to make progress, essentially, because you need people to expand the limits of our understanding of science and just production in general, innovation. And if we don't encounter these risks, we don't have people who are willing to take these risks, then we're not going to get anywhere. So I'm not saying that the deaths of these people are completely justified, but I'm saying that mistakes happen. And as long as it's not like willful negligence, like in the case of how Ford argued, in the sense that some of his own engineers bought his own cars, then I don't really see how big of an issue it is if like these people are genuine. Like they buy the car and they wholeheartedly believe that this is for them. This is a good deal. They accept the risks that are associated with it because they know of the risks themselves.
Okay. So you say it's a free. It's not a completely free market. We don't let people do whatever they want, right? So someone might want to buy a nuclear weapon and have a nuclear weapon because that's what they want. But we don't let them do that. And not only do we not let them do that, but we don't let corporations try to vie for that customer, right? The companies, businesses do not have the right, do not have the legal right to manufacture and sell nuclear weapons.
Well, of course, that's a very extreme example, but in most sense, like a very general sense, we're very capitalistic, and firms mostly determine the prices and supply and demand of most products that are in the market that are being exchanged. So yeah, there is some government regulation, no doubt about that, but a lot of what goes on is because of consumer supply and demand. Firms want to maximize the value they get out of selling, so they're going to produce things that give them the most value. They're going to try to reduce costs. They're going to try to make quality products at a lower cost, and consumers want to eat that up because
on that note, I also am kind of surprised that they didn't think far enough ahead to kind of recognize that there would and could and obviously are consequences to the public outrage that happened when this happened. So obviously there was a lot of public outrage when this happened, and people didn't want to buy those cars anymore. You know what I mean? If they had made the choice to put the $11 part in the car and to sell these cars, they could have been, selling and manufacturing these cars for several more generations, and people would have still been buying them. You know what I mean? It says it was manufactured in the 70s and the 80s. They could have, they could have gotten another 5 or 10 years out of that specific model of car and had several more newer models, newer versions that they could have then started modeling and being like, yes, this is safe because we did make this choice and we did foresee this consequence. You know what I mean?
Of course, but hindsight 2020, that's not something you can predict at that time very, very accurately, because like the professor said, a lot of the outrage was because of the large amount of sensationalism, but you can't exactly predict that. I mean, you sort of can, but you sort of can't. If your own engineers are buying your own products, there's a pretty good indication that they think this is a reasonable amount of risks associated with the product. Now, I mean, obviously, we see that there's a lot of risk for bad PR if something like that happens, like if there are a lot of accidents because of that, those safety issues. But there comes a point where maximizing for safety and minimizing, risk gives you diminishing marginal returns, because a lot of the stuff we do, even today, has some risk associated with it. It's all about minimizing risk. But when you're making a product, you can only reduce risk so much. And obviously they didn't reduce it as much as they should have, because again, hindsight 2020. But at that time, that's what they thought was their best option. And I mean, that's because they just carried that out. That's what they thought at that time. That was the best option given to them, maximizing the utility they get from producing that product without incurring as many diminishing marginal returns.
Yeah, that's good. So part of the challenge here is that the way that Ford is going to evaluate their own business success, what counts as success in the business world, is not necessarily the only standard that we can judge these things by, right? So,
of course.
This is why I was using the nuclear example, right? So it's an extreme example, but the point here is that the risk associated with that product is way too high, even if it's. I mean, if you had a business that bought and sold nuclear weapons, you'd probably make a lot of money, but it doesn't matter how much money you can make because the risk is too high. So we have these constraints, legal constraints on what the corporations can and cannot do. You can't buy and sell nuclear weapons, but you can do other things. And the important thing is that the constraints that the business operates under is different from the constraints that society can and should operate under. What counts as an acceptable risk to Ford might not be an acceptable risk to society, right? So Ford is willing to sacrifice the lives of Pinto drivers. And by the way, Pinto's it's a subcompact car, an economy car, which means that it's mostly lower income people who are buying this car, right? The CEO of Ford isn't taking a personal risk by manufacturing a cheap Pinto. He hasn't put himself in any danger at all. The person who's putting at risk are the consumers. And so Ford thinks, from the perspective of their business, that this is an acceptable risk to put the consumers' lives in danger. This is a very easy decision for Ford to make, because they're not putting themselves at risk. They're putting their consumers at risk. Even then, it doesn't seem like the right decision because of all these PR issues. But from an ethical perspective, you can say, okay, Ford has its business interests, but society has maybe stronger and broader interests in protecting safety that put stronger constraints on what we can and cannot do from just the business constraints that Ford operates under.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because you necessarily participate in society, so in general, society's rule has higher priority. But I mean, the way I view things, and I guess game theorists view life in general, is that playing according to society's rules is a nested game inside life. Your primary goal is to maximize utility for yourself, and you do that by abiding by the social contract. You do that by ceding some of your individual rights and your individualistic value systems to benefit the greater whole. And obviously, that isn't too much of a problem, but they are at odds. And in that situation, he thought he could beat the system, essentially. I mean, when people want to cut corners, that's essentially what they all think, until they're proven wrong, if they are proven wrong. And that's the thing. Like, the thing is with consequentialism is that you only get in trouble when you get caught for doing something wrong. You don't get caught for the wrong act itself, and that's just how life works. Because if no one knows that, like, you cut corners and your product is actually fully functional, at least appears to be, keyword appears, then you don't really incur any consequences.
Yeah, if you can get away with it, then everything's good. This is how the consequentialists, right? So if the Challenger explosion, if those O-rings hadn't failed, then it would have been the right decision to do, because everything would have been successful. Yeah. I mean, so you're exactly right that there's this challenge between thinking about maximizing my own interests, the selfish interests, versus maximizing the greater good. In the Pinto case, this is where the utilitarians are going to distinguish themselves from the consequentialists. The mere consequentialist is just trying to maximize their own interests. But the utilitarians aren't just interested in maximizing their personal benefits. They're interested in maximizing the greatest good for the greatest number, the overall well-being.
Yeah.
And maybe sort of selfish pursuits run at odds with the greater good.
So what kind of philosophical school of thought or discipline would be like kind of like utilitarianism, but like I don't weight the value of individuals in a ratio of 1-to-1, because there are obvious cases where some people are more important than others. And we see that reflected with the income gap, like how society perceives people to be of different value. How would you, like, is there any philosophical like school of thought for this other than like utilitarianism? Because I wouldn't say I'm utilitarian. Like I believe in maximizing the greatest amount of happiness, but not necessarily for the greatest amount of people. Because I do believe that, and this is very much reflected in society, that the people that contribute more do receive more back from society, as a general rule. Not
and you actually
obviously not
believe
the case. What?
And you actually believe that?
In a general sense, yeah. On average, yes. If you work more hours, if you contribute something of higher value to society, like you take a look at Facebook or Amazon, you will get more return on investment. And that's the entire premise that we associate in society, right? That's why we cede individual rights and individualistic value systems so that we get some benefits back from society. It's just Hobbesian social contract theory. Like the entire thing is just like, why do we do things? It's just because we expect to get something out of it. So if you don't incentivize people, they're not going to do it.
Yeah. Okay. Wait. So let's take this carefully. So I think I agree with you about this last point, that people need incentives to do what they're going to do.
Yeah, proportional. Yeah.
Well, they need incentives. The thing that I'm quite skeptical of is that because people act on incentives, that means that what people get is what they deserve. The view that you're defending, one thing you were saying was how people aren't equal, but the view you're defending here, I think that's maybe a little bit easier to deal with, it is it's called a meritocracy. So you're claiming that our capitalist system is a meritocracy. Meritocracy in the sense that it's controlled by the people who deserve to control it, so that the people who are wealthy are the people who actually work more and contribute more to society. And conversely, the people who are poor are the people who aren't contributing very much at all.
As a general rule, but not, obviously, it doesn't encompass everyone. It's just an average.
Yeah. So I think this is even wrong, like factually incorrect, dramatically factually incorrect, even in the average. So the immigrant laborer who's picking strawberries in a field for 10 hours a day without any health care or any kind of legal protections at all, and is making a few dollars an hour, or is making money on the basis of how many strawberries they pick. They're doing a lot more work. They're putting in a lot more effort. It's having a much greater physical toll on their lives, but they're being paid dramatically out of proportion with the work they're doing. Compare that to
it really depends on how you define a cost.
Wait. So compare that to a hedge fund manager who might work 6 hours a day and make $20 million in that day, and never leave their desk and drinking wine the whole time. The idea that person has worked more and so deserves more than the person working in the field seems completely ludicrous to me. It seems like mind-bogglingly incorrect to me.
It really depends on how you define work and cost, because society has a system of incentivizing people, and basically the amount of money you earn has some relationship to what you contribute to society. So my question to you is, who's more important to society as a whole? The manager who gets all of these farmers together, brings the means of production together, or one individual farmer?
I mean, my response to that is that the manager is basically doing nothing, and that it's the workers who are doing all the work. It's the workers who run the economy, and the managers just steal from the workers.
As an aggregate, yeah, they do run the economy, but individually,
I
what
mean,
skills do they have to bring people and organize them and systemize processes? That takes a lot of work. It might not be physical work. It might not be, it might not be costing someone's lives. But again, it's really about how you evaluate cost and benefit here. Benefit to society is something that allows it to progress in general. Something that allows it, in a general sense, to maximize happiness for the greatest number of individuals, right? But obviously, your value system is very different in the sense that you consider a physical toll to be a higher cost than someone to bring people together and systemize processes. Whether you're a hedge fund manager or you're managing the farm, being like micromanaging, macromanaging all of these different tasks, all these different labors does take a certain amount of skill, and that is more valuable to society, and that's reflected by how much more they make. Obviously, it's not completely accurate. We can't exactly quantify these things down to the decimal point, but these are things that have worked.
So consider a couple of things. One thing is that doing exhausting physical labor on a regular basis will cut years off your life. The people who are slaving away in the fields, those are years off their life. Those are medical problems and all kinds of stuff that result from doing physical labor. If someone is literally trading years of their life, like that's an incredibly valuable contribution. And right, so your view. So maybe this isn't exactly your view, but just for this devil's argument, the view is that the system that we have is a meritocracy, so that the people who succeed in the system are the people who deserve to succeed, and the people who don't succeed in the system are the people who don't deserve to succeed.
Yeah, exactly. It's the principle of natural selection, social Darwinism.
Yeah, so the idea is that if you see someone rich, then obviously they did a bunch of things to deserve to be rich. And when you see someone poor, then obviously they made a bunch of mistakes in order to deserve to be poor. Right?
Not entirely, but that is the general trend.
Yeah,
like for me, the ideal society would be like, you have a capitalistic economy, but it would probably have like a 95%, 98% inheritance tax or something like that. Because I believe in the value of merit. That's what I value. That's just my value system. If you can get the results, however you do it, as long as you play by the rules, you get what you deserve.
Yeah.
Right. But obviously, that's not how we work now.
Yeah. So this is the big thing, is that it's not that I'm disagreeing with you about the value of merit. What I'm disagreeing with you about is that the economic conditions of people reflect their merit. That people who are rich deserve to be rich, and people who are poor deserve to be poor. I don't think that's the case at all. You mentioned inheritance, and this is in fact the case. Most people who are rich inherited that wealth. They earned that wealth by being the kid to someone who is wealthy.
But that money has to have made itself somehow through someone else.
Yeah, so someone's parents did, right? But that means that the person who's rich now, I mean, Donald Trump, right? Donald Trump didn't make that money. Donald Trump inherited that.
Okay, yeah, I can agree with that.
Right? And that means that he's rich without deserving it. And I want to say that, in fact, this is the rule, that most people with money didn't actually earn that money, and that most people who are poor deserve a lot more than they have. My favorite example of how our economic system is not a meritocracy, and in fact does not reflect actual social value, so that the rich people don't deserve to be rich and so on, is how we recognize some of the most important kinds of labor in our society. My favorite example is raising children, caring for a household. This is typically, traditionally, women's work, but not necessarily.
Okay.
But it's also work that's not reflected in the economic system, right? So the labor that's required for watching those kids all day and taking care of the house all day, and all the cleaning and all the errands that are required to maintain a house. None of this is reflected in the economy at all, right? Housewives are not paid for their labor.
Yes.
Mothers are not paid for raising their children. Raising our children is, without a doubt, the most important thing that we do in society. Raising and teaching our future generations, because they're the ones who are eventually run the world. Raising them is the most important thing that we do. And the primary people responsible for raising our children don't get any money from it at all right now. Think about the value in your home of, for instance, your grandmother, who's retired, but is a wealth of knowledge and experience and tradition, right? Your grandmother might be the thing that keeps the family unit together, but the grandma doesn't get paid for that. There's no business that writes your grandma a check for being a grandma. These kinds of cases convince me beyond a shadow of a doubt that the economic value reflected in money, finances, does not reflect actual human value. And in fact, it dramatically distorts actual human value. So that it's really, really important that we understand that this is not a meritocracy, and that the people who succeed often succeed by nefarious means, by means that don't earn the benefits they get, and vice versa, that the people who suffer in our system aren't suffering because of any mistakes that they made, but because the system itself is unfair. I'm not saying
sense, but the idea is that, I think I mentioned this before in like an earlier writing, that sure, some people and a lot of people do inherit a lot of wealth, and that's true. But it's because that there was some development in their family or whatever relationship they had with their wealth that they've got where they are now, because it just goes along with the principle of natural selection. People who have favorable traits in the system. Obviously, the system is not perfect. There are many flaws with it, but people who have favorable traits will survive.
Yeah,
I mean, who don't,
no,
just don't.
You need to. I mean, this is incorrect, and you need to break yourself of this notion. So, for instance, the dinosaurs died out. I mean, if you're thinking about natural selection evolution, the dinosaurs died out through no fault of their own. They were hit by a meteor, right?
Yeah.
That does not demonstrate that they're unfit for survival. That was an accident.
The system changed, and
the
if the system changed, then they're not favorable in the new system. That's it.
Yeah, well, but the point is that this is not a sign of, this is not an evidence of merit. This is not an evidence of the value of the creature. It doesn't have
to be merit necessarily.
I
basically said not all lives are equal, right. And that's the main thing I go off of. Merit is just an extension of that because it's the best way to relate to people in that sense. But there are some people who have more value. It just is. Like,
there are people who have more money.
Not necessarily more money. Let's say you were on an island, right? He's stranded with a bunch of people, 10 people, and one of them is a doctor, and the rest of you are not well versed in the medical field in any way. This person obviously has more value because they can keep you alive. Now, this is a very dramatic example, but if you take into context how society works, there are some people that just have more value than others because they specialize. Like the reason that because
they do more important work.
In a sense, yes. Yeah, that's how society values it. That's why doctors get paid a lot, right?
Good. So I don't want to disagree with you that some, I think it's context sensitive. Like some people might be really important in some contexts, but not important in others, and vice versa.
Yeah, it varies. Yeah, definitely.
So I can agree with you on that. My disagreement here is not that merit distributes in this way. My disagreement is that the actual merit, the actual value of these people is reflected in things like their economic status.
Backwards, right? Yeah.
So, the inheritance is the easy case. For all those kids that are inheriting their wealth, they didn't do anything to earn that wealth. They don't have that wealth in virtue of any kind of merit of their own. They have that wealth maybe in virtue of the merit of their parents. But even this gets difficult, right? So there are systemic issues here. When we're talking about, let me just bring this back to the Ford. I should probably stop soon because I've been talking for over an hour. So we've been talking, we were talking about Ford making their business decisions, and then we were talking separately about how society has separate rules that it might want to enforce independently, and presumably we should make Ford subsume under the general society rules, but it's not that easy, and Ford can do things like lobby government to change the rules in their favor, right? So a lot of the defense of Ford in the Pinto case says that, look, Ford was obeying the laws at the time. They were operating within the laws. They were operating within the, the figure that they put on a human life. That was a federally mandated figure from the federal actuarial tables. And so it looks like, look, Ford is following the rules. Society sets the rules. Ford is operating within the rules. Where can you blame them? the problem is that Ford doesn't just operate within the rules, Ford sets the rules. Ford makes enough money that it can have a huge influence over the operation of government, over the passing of laws, over the decisions of politicians. And so the particular rules that Ford was operating under, and they were operating under the law, they were operating the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, had just passed so the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration had just come onto the scene in the middle of the Pinto scandal. And the Pinto was operating within the NHTSA standards. The thing is that the NHTSA, as it was being set up, had a huge amount of influence from the automotive industry generally and from Ford in particular. So Ford was developing that government regulatory body to have standards that would be favorable to Ford's offerings like the Pinto. This is cheating. I just want to make very clear, this is cheating. If the fair way to play is to play by the rules. The cheating way is to change the rules so that they operate in your favor. And when corporations lobby governments to change the rules, change the tax codes or whatever to be in their favor, this isn't fair play. This is unfair play. Now that might make them more successful, right? And if our only measure of success is how much money they make, then cheating the system could make you very successful. But that doesn't mean that you deserve that success. That doesn't mean, right? That success is independent of the merit.
Yeah. Like, ideally, there would be some direct relationship with merit and the value contribute to society, but that's not what I'm saying. I don't believe in moral desert, as John Rawls said. If I believe he said something along the lines of like, you can't morally expect some things. You can have reasonable expectations based on just basic causation, but you can't expect moral desert. You can't do that. And when people fail to abide by the principles of moral desert, you can't be mad at them because that's just natural. To be moral is to naturally, or to at least appear to be naturally, putting the interests of others and the conventions of society ahead of your own interests. But at the core of every action is your own interests. So when people act according to their own interests, you can't blame them.
Yes, you can, especially if they do something wrong. If it's in your if I'm applying for a job and there's someone else who's applying for that job also, but it's in my interest to get that job, so I kill the other person. You can definitely blame me for killing that person, even if I'm acting in my own interest, even if I'm doing what I think is best for myself.
Well, again, this comes from a viewpoint of moral relativism. The idea that just there's no objective right or wrong. It's just favorable or unfavorable. Like, for example, very extreme example, if Hitler won World War II, his faction would likely be considered morally correct if he's taken over the world. People believe what they're doing is right at that given time and moment based on the value system that they've generated from accumulated experience. And if you do that, you're basically saying that the consequences of the law being enforced on you are less than, the satisfaction of A, killing that person, and B, temporarily having this job. That's what the action would imply, but I wouldn't say anything is wrong. I would just say that you made a very inefficient decision. You made something that, from my value system, says that you don't know or you don't weigh the consequences appropriately. But then you could also argue, if you actually did that wholeheartedly, that this was worth it. To me, I could say, okay, you believe that, and I respect what you believe, but that's just not efficient if your goal is to have the job for a long time and be a functioning member of society. Like, I can say that, like, I reconcile this idea that, pragmatism, like this idea that some things, even though we can't exactly discern objective truth, we call things truths and facts because they work. Right? Like you mentioned in the first class, you say you're a pragmatist. I'm very much like that too. But at the same time, I can recognize when it comes to moral systems and just value systems in general, for me, because we can't access a point of objective truth, we can't say for sure definitively that there is objective right or wrong. What I'm saying is, you can believe what you want to believe. Like, my friend can believe that we're all unicorns, but I probably just wouldn't be his friend anymore. Like, I can respect that. I won't call him stupid. I won't call him anything like that. But if he wants to get things done, there are some things that we know works. And that's what we call facts, even though we don't exactly know if it's objective truth. So in this sense, what you were saying, yeah, sure. If you want to do that, by all means do that. But do know there's going to be some reasonable consequences, reasonable expectations that are just going to occur because you live in a society where there are rules and the enforcement is very reliable.
That should cut against Pinto also, cut against Ford also, right? If the people decide that we want to tighten up regulations so that auto manufacturers can't build these shitty cars anymore, then we can do that, and we can put these constraints on businesses. We can prevent businesses from doing things that we don't think are socially acceptable. That's possible to do. We have the legal frameworks for doing it.
Yeah, but it's just the people operating these frameworks obviously don't have these interests.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. This is it's a very weak defense of Ford that you're giving, though. I mean, your defense of Ford is that Ford didn't do anything wrong because there is no right and wrong. I mean, okay, and it's fine. But it's a very weak defense of Ford.
I mean, like if you're arguing purely from a moral stance, then yeah. But I don't really consider that because morality is relative. Just depending on who you talk to, they're going to say different things that are right and wrong. Like if you talk to someone who was raised in Al-Qaeda, they're going to think that the killing of Americans is not only morally acceptable but also virtuous. But there's going to be consequences. So in the sense that, yeah, he messed up and there's sensationalist reviews. Yeah, he messed up, right? That's just the result justifies whatever happened. But at the same time, I can't exactly blame him because you have people who are saying, hey, I want this car too. They worked for him. They worked on that project. So there was no clear indication. Or, I mean, yes, there were some clear indications when we look at it from hindsight, but if they're buying their own, that same car, the indication wasn't clear to them. Obviously, otherwise they wouldn't have bought it, right?
I mean that it could be it could be a PR stunt, right? You could get an engineer to say, hey, will you buy these cars, so that it looks like we're all okay. And I mean, you see this on advertisements generally. The celebrities saying that they drink whatever energy drink and they don't actually drink that energy drink, but they'll tell people that they do because it makes people think that it's a more reliable product.
Of course, yeah, that could have happened, but at the same time, we have to just look at what's more probable here. Like, what does this person have to benefit out of this? They're taking a lot of money out of their own pocket to buy cars. They're probably not getting paid that much if they're just working on an assembly line or something like that. So yeah, that's definitely a possibility. There's always a possibility. Just like there's also a possibility that you're gonna die from just entering your car and it explodes, or that someone on the road just is drunk and crashes into you. There's gonna be some uncertainty, but we gotta roll with it. That's the entire premise of pragmatism, right? Like most of the time, some things make sense and it's consistent. And we can use reasoning, logic, to see what is most probable versus the things that are not as probable. Of course, I can't deny the possibility of that happening. That's like, if you want to take it to an extreme example, that's like the same thing as me saying God doesn't exist. We don't know that, empirically at least. Like, we have to accept that there's some reasonable level of doubt with every action, but we have to accept that. And yeah, that could have happened. I'm not denying that, but more than likely, if not only him, that person that bought those two cars and several other engineers that were working on it bought cars, it's more than likely that that's just what they thought at the time. That's what I would deduce. You might deduce it differently, but that's just what I'm seeing. And whether we agree or not, I mean, that's the purpose of discourse.
Yeah, I guess I don't see pragmatism as just rolling, as just roll with it kind of view. My worry is that the view that you're putting forward doesn't give us any room to make recommendations for how to change systems. I mean, you just change systems however you want. If you were interested in this, then do that. If you're interested in something else, then do something else. But there's there's no direction there to how we.
Well, the idea is that while I can say that there's no moral right or wrong, I can say some things are more efficient than others. Like the entire premise of using empirical truth as opposed to objective truth. We know for sure, at least like while we're in the system of reality, that these buildings around us exist, and there are some mathematical physics foundations upon which they were built. And we use these foundations, and we still use them because they're consistent and they've proven to work empirically. Otherwise, these buildings would not exist, right? So what you can say is that you treat some issue as a black box. You look at the input, look at the output, and you try to tweak the settings in the middle, that black box. You try to mess around with that so that you can achieve an optimal outcome. Just treat it like a big scientific experiment. Like what is the function, and how do you manipulate this function to give you a desirable result?
Yeah, good. So I think that's right. So pragmatism is about generating being able to generate the results. It's a practical matter, being able to accomplish whatever goals you have. But pragmatism itself, I don't think, tells you what your goals should be.
Oh, of course not. But right. Yeah, that's the point of life. You define your goals, right?
Well, so this is tricky, right? So you might define your goals as being purely self-interested, but you might define goals in other ways also. And if pragmatism isn't telling you how to define your goals, it only tells you that once you have your goals, here's how to accomplish them. And we still have to start not just by deciding that we're pragmatists, but also deciding about what we want to do.
Yeah, and that's the moral argument, right? The moral and emotional argument gives you reason to set goals yourself. Otherwise, you wouldn't get out of bed, right?
Right.
Like the entire premise of having a value system lets you do that. Right. Like taking in information and reacting upon it and doing something about it. Right. But like basically what I'm saying is when it comes to choosing your goals, there is no right and wrong. But if ever a bunch of people have similar goals, like if you take a look at the population as an aggregate, there are similar goals like raising the standard of living, then you can alter the system so that it facilitates that.
Right.
Is that likely to happen? And like how do you define increasing the standard of living? That's obviously up to interpretation, and that's why self-interest gets in the way of these politicians. They put their own self-interest, and because their standard of living is increasing, they must think that everyone else's is, or at least they appear to be. But the idea is just that while pragmatism doesn't tell you what goals to set, it does tell you how to achieve them.
Yeah.
What goals you set is purely up to you. And like, I wouldn't consider myself an existentialist because I don't deny the existence of an objective truth, nor do I confirm it. But I'm saying just because we can't measure it, we can't approach it, doesn't mean we don't have any value at all. And like the actions we do, just because we can't objectively measure it or look at it objectively, doesn't mean we don't have value at all. I'm not sure what that would be called, because it's definitely not nihilism, but it's definitely not existentialism.
A lack of objective value? Yeah, relativism, maybe. Contextualism.
Is it just relativism? Huh. Because like I just approach everything from a scientific point of view. It's like it's all skepticism. Just I don't know if God does or does not exist, so I'm not going to say I'm an atheist. I'm not going to say I believe in it, because I think both of those two, believing those absolutes, is equally fallacious. Because you're believing in the absolute. For me, everything is true until proven wrong. Just how the Newtonian model of physics was accepted as universal truth back then. It collapses in very large settings through general relativity, or really small settings through quantum physics. And we adapt our models, we adapt the systems we use to account for these things that we find empirically. But again, what we want to find empirically, or what we want to do with these systems, is really up to interpretation. And because everyone has their own view of how they can benefit, even like the selfless person, when they help other people, the satisfaction they feel from helping other people outweighs the cost of helping that person. Because everyone defines that differently, it's very hard to reach consistent definitions of what is morally correct for like a very broad term, like for not term, a very broad sense in the sense of the entire population of Earth. Because if you take a look at like big wars, whoever won that war is considered morally correct. Like if you look at the Crusades, for example, the systematic like pillaging and raping of the Seljuk Turks was considered morally correct to the people that were crusading. But obviously to someone who was, I guess, affected by that, that would be not only morally incorrect, but it's just heinous. It's detestable. It's just unfavorable. So when I define like from moral good to moral bad, it's honestly to me just favorable to unfavorable and just varying degrees. It's just a spectrum on a single axis.
Thank you for sharing all that. I mean, I have a lot to say. Moral theory is fun, and we're going to be talking a lot. So we just started introducing moral theory, and it was consequentialism. And we'll talk about deontology, and we'll talk about virtue ethics. Virtue ethics is, I don't know if I believe virtue ethics, but it's my favorite to talk about, for sure. So keep having these discussions. Keep thinking about where our values come from, why we have the values we have, and how our values disagree with each other. I mean, these are the big core philosophical issues in the background happening here. I guess I wanted to say that maybe things aren't as relativistic as you make them out to be, sort of completely hopeless and coordinating on values. And I think the way this happens is by settling on goals. So the engineering, this is the NSP Code of Ethics, we've looked at this before. The first fundamental canon of the Code of Ethics is that engineers shall in their professional duties hold paramount to the safety, health, and welfare of the public. Not everyone believes that this is the paramount obligation, that this is paramount duty. Right? So people might disagree about whether this should be the paramount duty. But I think there's less controversy over whether some particular act counts as holding paramount to the health, safety, and welfare of the public. I think even if you and I disagree about whether this should be the primary moral concern, we should still be able to agree that Ford's decision, was not a case of holding paramount to safety, health, and welfare of the public.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I can definitely agree with that.
Yeah. So from a pragmatist perspective, if what we're interested in is accomplishing these goals, and let's just say for the sake of argument we've set for ourselves these goals, then we can say with some objectivity that Ford has failed to meet these standards. Now that doesn't mean that Ford accepts these standards in the first place.
Yeah, but that's if we're just looking from the lens of society. If you're looking from the lens of Ford, obviously he didn't do anything wrong. If you're looking from his perspective, if you look at it as like a society as an entire aggregate, then yeah, obviously what he did is wrong, and that's reflected by the consequences he incurred.
Well, so I'm not, maybe one way of understanding my point here is to say that it's not right and wrong in the absolute sense, but it's right and wrong relative to certain goals we have. So if the goal is to maximize safety, then Ford is not the right way to do it. And we can say that objective. It's not a matter of just opinion that Ford's not right. That from a pragmatic standpoint, just like a practical standpoint, you can't protect safety by making decisions the way Ford is making decisions.
Yeah. And that's the idea. What I said before, you can't say morally, like absolute or like objective moral correctness or incorrectness. But what I can say is, depending on what your goals are, things can be more efficient or less efficient. And obviously, in the case of, I guess, preserving human life, that was not as efficient as it could have been. And that's why it reflected there. Yeah, I agree with that. And that's like that's what I basically act on. Like, is something efficient? Is this going to work? And if it's not, how do I change that?
Yeah.
And in the sense of like things that like we consider morally correct, my belief is that morals and like ethical value systems in general, passed down through societies, is a result of, again, natural selection. Societies that allowed gratuitous murder or other things unfavorable to the survival of a group perished very quickly, and that's why we don't see them where they are now. We don't see them in that image now. Now, 21st century, or like if you look at the more developed countries, they have certain things in common, and these are just the favorable traits that allow them to survive, and that's why they're here. Because obviously a society that allows for gratuitous murder is just not going to survive. It's not much different from a Hobbesian state of nature where you can just kill anyone. But
Are we talking
that's
about the
the
United States
explanation.
right now, or no? We're not talking about the United States. Sorry.
I mean that in general, like they're the way, like the countries exist now because they've had favorable traits that have allowed them to survive. Like they don't allow gratuitous murder. They don't do that.
We should. I should really stop this. We're at an hour and a half now. I'm going to stop this now. I want to keep having these conversations. You might want to come to office, like my office hours on Tuesday, to have these conversations some more.
Yeah, sure.
This is great. I really want you to think carefully about whether the practical methods we have for distributing wealth actually reflect the distribution.
Well, I very much agree with you in the sense that, yeah, inheritance is a very big issue. That's why in my ideal society, it's 95%, 98% inheritance tax, because that's the main problem with this system.
No, I think. I mean, inheritance is it's an easy case to look at where it's clear that the person who inherits hasn't earned it. But I don't think it's the main problem. I think the main problem is that the capitalist framework we have for moving wealth around doesn't track merit at all. It tracks things like greed, right? And so we end up rewarding people who are greedy.
I do think greed is a byproduct of just capitalism and meritocracy in general, because greed is just self-interest, right?
Yeah,
but the idea is that
but that doesn't make it a good. That doesn't make it a good thing. And I'm sort of worried about the way that you're thinking about evolution. Evolution doesn't always reward the best creatures. It sometimes rewards creatures who just happen to be in the right place at the right time.
And that's it.
Yeah, right.
The system has rewarded things that, based on the parameters of that system, are favorable. And that's it. Well, I'm not saying something's morally right or superior or inferior. It's just that in general, they did something, or they were just at the right place at the right time. And they survive. Obviously, natural selection is not a perfect system, but it's a general trend that we see.
I mean, the trend isn't always that the fittest survive, though. I mean,
if a system has changed so that like the previous fittest don't survive, then that's just because the system changed. You're still obeying the law of natural selection.
Yeah, but part of fitness, part of the fitness criteria might be my capacity to change my environment. So it's not just that I'm subject to my environment, and if I do well, I win, and if I do poorly, I die. It's also that I can change my environment in order to engineer conditions where I can do well. Right. So the atmosphere is filled with oxygen, and that's because a bunch of bacteria put that oxygen in the.
It's kind of part of the system, though. Some parts of it are malleable.
Yeah.
Like if you look at it like just from a game theory perspective, there's this. Again, it's like this environment, the system that you are in now is just nested within the larger system of reality, and there's some things that you can alter, even further nested systems in the system that you're in, and you can use this to your advantage, and that's what I would just consider a favorable trait. Your ability to adapt or even manipulate the environment around you, that's a trait. And I don't believe that like these traits are fixed. Like let's say physical strength, I might be able to bicep curl 25 today, but in like a year or two I might be able to bicep curl a 35. These traits are not fixed. And so like there's this I'm not sure if it was from Plato, but I do remember one Greek philosopher saying that like that was relevant. But the idea is that there's this this idea that the strong oppress the weak and the weak are oppressed by the strong, but these are just arbitrary classifications, and you can change from one to the other depending on your circumstances, whether either the system has affected you or you've done something stupid. Like there are some people, although not too many, that go from riches down to rags because they were careless and they were being really stupid. But it happens, and that's one of those ways that you can change from these arbitrary classifications. Obviously, these classifications, they're arbitrary, but they're useful in just sorting things out and giving structure to things. And that's why we use these classifications, right? Now, I mean,
I don't want to cut you out. I didn't mean to cut it. We can have these conversations for like 20 years, I'm sure. But we should stop here just for the sake of everyone else. They don't have to watch. Did I say the secret word?
Secret word? No, I don't know
Secret word
that.
is trolley. Secret word is trolley. Secret word is trolley.
Okay. All right, cool. So, when are your office hours again?
Tuesday at 10 o'clock. Also by appointment. If you want to make an appointment with me,
Yeah, that might be better. I'll shoot you an email or something. Yeah.
Yeah, sounds good.
All right. See ya.
Yeah, thanks for trying. Having a deep conversation about ethics like this is great.
Yeah, discourse is great. I love differing opinions because it allows me to refine my own.
Yeah.
And similarly for you.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. Okay. I'm just going to stop it there. This will all go up on YouTube and on the website. Thank you everyone for watching. Thank you, Tim, for talking.
Yep. See ya.
See you next week.